It's been quite a while since we heard any new updates about getting samples from Mars back to Earth. So is that project still on? What's the latest news? And if so, what are the plans and when could we expect to see the samples? Let's find out. This is the space race. The last update we got about the Mars sample return mission was that NASA had partnered up with SpaceX to get the samples back to Earth using their Falcon Heavy rocket. That was back in November 2020. Now, this was a big deal, because for the first time, NASA was partnering up with a private company to do some science. Usually, NASA either does all the work themselves or partners up with other government agencies like the ESA, the European Space Agency. But in this case, they went for a private company, and it seemed like a great choice at the time. SpaceX already had a heavy-lift rocket available, the Falcon Heavy, and plenty of experience launching stuff into deep space, and it all seemed to be going well until SpaceX crashed a Falcon 9 rocket shortly after launch. And then again just a few months later with another Falcon 9 explosion, this time destroying an expensive Israeli satellite that was supposed to be launched into space. To make matters worse, just days after the second Falcon 9 failure, the United Launch Alliance, a joint venture between Boeing and Lockheed Martin, also failed to launch their Atlas V rocket. But NASA stayed with SpaceX anyway, which has turned out to be a good decision so far. Since then, SpaceX have not only fixed their Falcon 9 rocket, but now launch it almost every week without fail. And they've also launched their first Starship rocket and are working hard to fix the issues that caused that one to explode. More on that later. Meanwhile, the United Launch Alliance is still struggling to fix their Atlas V rocket, which has been grounded ever since that failure in December 2020. But NASA doesn't seem too concerned because they've got more options than just those two. In June of this year, for example, NASA announced that they would be able to use the Ariane 5 rocket by the European Space Agency to bring the sample home. The plan is for the European rocket to take a fetch rover to Mars, pick up the sample from Perseverance, and then head back to Earth with it. But the problem with that plan is that the earliest that an Ariane 5 rocket can launch is not until September 2027. Then it takes another 2 years to get the sample back to Earth. So according to that plan, we wouldn't get our hands on the sample until at least 2029. And if anything goes wrong along the way, that date will just slip further and further into the future. And we know how unreliable rockets can be. Take the James Webb Space Telescope, for example. It was supposed to launch in 2018, but thanks to engineering problems and delays, it didn't finally launch until 2021. And even then, it had more problems. Parts of the telescope were damaged during the launch, and then more parts started to break after it arrived at its destination. And then there's the most obvious example of all, Starship, which has had many test launches planned and scheduled, but each time something goes wrong at the very last minute and it gets canceled. SpaceX have been trying to launch this fully reusable interplanetary transport system since late 2020, and they've managed to launch it twice, but both times the rocket exploded. Starship needs to be reliable, because if we're going to send humans to Mars, we're going to need a lot of these vehicles. So Starship needs to work, and SpaceX need to perfect it. So that means that the 2029 date for getting the samples back to Earth using an Ariane 5 rocket isn't really looking very promising. And that's why NASA are pushing ahead with the Falcon Heavy option. But surely that's even riskier considering the history that SpaceX have with their Falcon 9 and their Falcon Heavy rockets. Well, maybe, but it's actually pretty unlikely that something will go wrong with the next launch. Since November 2020, SpaceX have launched their Falcon 9 and their Falcon Heavy rockets more than 50 times, and none of them have failed. Sure, one of the Falcon 9 rockets did explode recently while it was on the ground, but that's different to what happened back in 2015 and 2016 when the Falcon 9 rockets exploded in midair. Those failures were due to issues with the second stage of the rocket, but those issues have long been identified and fixed. In fact, the recent explosion on the ground was actually a great example of how far SpaceX have come, because even though the rocket exploded, it didn't damage anything around it. All the other rockets that failed back in 2015 and 2016 took chunks of concrete with them when they exploded. But the one that failed in June 2023 only took out a fire suppression system inside the rocket. And SpaceX have already fixed this issue by changing the design of the rocket. But if SpaceX can get their Starship rocket working, then that might be a better option than the Falcon Heavy. That's because the Starship is fully reusable, whereas the Falcon 9 isn't. Only the booster stage comes back down and lands. The payload section that carries the cargo always gets jettisoned and burnt up in the atmosphere. So if SpaceX can get Starship working, then they could reuse the entire vehicle to pick up the sample on Mars and bring it back to Earth. If they could master this, then it would make interplanetary travel much cheaper. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars instead of billions. That's probably why NASA said earlier this year that they weren't going to commit to using the Falcon Heavy until they knew for sure whether or not Starship would work. NASA want the cheapest, quickest way to get the samples back to Earth. And right now, Starship looks like that option, even though it's still not ready yet. NASA said that they would make a decision by the end of 2023 about whether or not to use the Starship or the Falcon Heavy. But it's now clear that they need to wait a little longer. Starship keeps getting delayed. SpaceX originally hoped to launch their next test flight in August, but on July, Elon Musk tweeted that it would be pushed back to October at the earliest. So NASA will definitely have to wait a little longer before they decide which rocket they're going to use. But when they do make that decision, whichever rocket they choose will have to get to work quickly because we don't want the sample sitting around on Mars for too long. According to scientists, Mars has changed a lot since the last time Earth saw it up close in the 1970s. Back then, the planet had lots of volcanoes erupting and whole areas of the surface were being reshaped by massive landslides. But over the past 50 years, Mars has gone quiet. There have been no major signs of geological activity, and scientists think that this might have something to do with the magnetic fields around the planet. When Mars was young, it rotated much faster. This made it generate a magnetic field that protected the planet from the solar wind. Over billions of years, the planet slowed down and the magnetic field disappeared. And as soon as that happened, the solar wind stripped away the atmosphere until only a thin shell remained. And this lack of atmosphere is probably why there's no sign of life on Mars today. So we really want to get that sample back to Earth because who knows how long it will be until we get another chance. But how long will it take once the rocket leaves Mars? The journey from Mars to Earth is never straightforward because the planets are always moving. So the distance between them is always changing. And rockets can't travel in a straight line because they have to follow the curves in space. That's called gravity turns. So depending on the route that the rocket takes, it could take anywhere between 6 and 9 months for it to get to Earth. And then once it arrives, it won't just drop straight down into the atmosphere. It'll start off by making a gravity turn, slowing itself down as it does. This part of the journey will take several weeks. Then as it gets closer to Earth, it'll start to make a steeper descent, and that's when we'll start to worry about burning up in the atmosphere. This part of the journey will happen so fast that we won't be able to do anything about it. We can't even watch it live because it would take several minutes for the signal to reach us from deep space. So we'll know about it long after it happens. Then finally, the rocket will enter the atmosphere and start to slow down again, eventually landing in the desert of Utah, where scientists will be waiting to collect the sample. Now it's important to remember that each of these stages could go wrong. Rockets can explode, they can crash land, they can get knocked off course. And if any of those things happen, then the sample will just be lost forever. Getting samples from other planets is a huge challenge, and it's going to take a long time before we see the results of this mission. But if it works, then it will change our understanding of the universe forever.